What's genuinely strange about Catherine being given sole guardianship of the crown jewels is the setting it happened in. Midnight. Charles reportedly falling apart, and the two people you'd assume would be standing right beside him, his wife and the heir to his throne, deliberately kept out of the room. That isn't a family working through something together. That's a man making absolutely certain nobody could stop his hand from moving across that page. And when you learn he was asked not once but twice whether he wanted Camilla or William present, and rejected both suggestions, you start to understand something the official statements will never admit about what's actually unfolding behind those palace walls. It began at a formal reception for foreign dignitaries inside the state dining room at Buckingham Palace. Charles simply went down. Full physical collapse in front of every guest in that room. Security moved instantly, snatching phones from hands before a single image could escape, which fits the pattern of how fiercely they've been guarding his public appearance lately. But it also means whatever really happened in there exists only in the memories of the people who witnessed it, and the palace has been surgical about which fragments of that memory are permitted to reach the outside world. Guests were funneled out through side corridors. Physicians arrived through an entrance most of the staff didn't even know existed, and when they finally left his private chambers, the clock was almost striking 12. Whatever those doctors said inside that room has never made it past the palace gates. This is where the timeline starts to feel wrong. A few weeks after that collapse, Charles appeared on camera and mentioned that his treatment might be scaled back in the new year. Everyone breathed easier. It sounded like recovery. It sounded like the storm was passing. But what's leaking out now paints a completely different picture. In that same week, his medical team had pulled him aside privately and delivered news that ran in the opposite direction. A second indicator had turned aggressive, and it was progressing faster than anyone on his team had been prepared to handle. So two entirely opposite stories were running side by side. The public one, engineered around the softness of a single word, reduce, to imply things were improving. And the private one, where his own doctors were quietly warning him to brace for acceleration. Somebody inside that building decided the second diagnosis would stay buried and let the country carry on believing everything was steady. That hidden truth is the real spark beneath everything that came next. Because if you're Charles and you've just been told inside some quiet clinical room that your remaining time may be dramatically shorter than the world realizes, your mind stops thinking about calendars. It starts thinking about the moment after. His private secretary reportedly pleaded with him to at least sleep on it until morning. Charles wouldn't hear it. Whatever those doctors said had lit a fire in him that refused to wait a single hour longer. The royal solicitor was pulled from his bed after midnight and driven to the palace to witness a signature on a document that under normal conditions would have required months of careful legal review. Instead, the entire thing was executed in one room, in the deep silence of the night, while everyone else in the palace slept. Before we go further, if you're following this breakdown, tap subscribe to Royal Decode so the next chapter doesn't pass you by. There's still much more to this story, and it's still moving. The detail that really makes something feel deeply off comes straight from the royal solicitor's own private notes from that night. Before Charles put pen to paper, he was asked twice whether he wanted Camilla or William in the room with him. Twice, he refused. This wasn't a panicked reflex or a rushed reaction. He had the space to summon either of them, and he intentionally chose not to. He locked both of them out of the very room where his family's entire future was being redrawn. And if you're wondering why a king who knows time is running out would shut out the two people supposedly closest to him at the most important moment of his reign, the answer is probably also the harshest one. Charles didn't want anyone nearby who might try to yank the pen from his fingers, delay him, or push their own name onto that paper before the ink had time to dry. This wasn't a king sharing a moment with his family. This was a king shielding a decision from them. So he signed. Sole control of the crown jewels transferred permanently to Catherine. And according to people who were there, the only thing he said afterward was 3 words. It is done. No smile, no exhale, no relief. Just the flat, hollow voice of a man who had been dragging this burden behind him for years and finally decided to drop it in one silent midnight, whatever the cost to the people he'd spent a lifetime claiming to love. Some of you are probably wondering whether a king can actually do this on his own, in the middle of the night, without seeking permission from anyone? And the answer is yes. The British monarchy operates through something called the royal prerogative, a power that hands a reigning monarch enormous personal authority over anything directly tied to the crown, with no need for Parliament's approval or anyone else's. The crown jewels sit firmly inside that authority. Legally, everything Charles did that night was within his rights. No signature of consent required. No vote needed. Nothing. What made it so extraordinary wasn't the legality. It was the pace. Decisions of this scale usually unfold across years, argued over in soft voices behind closed doors, negotiated and cushioned until nobody feels ambushed. Charles shredded that tradition. He compressed years of careful preparation into one midnight signature. And that alone told everyone paying attention exactly how much time he believed he had left. When you look at what these treasures have already lived through, the whole picture becomes even sharper. They were once destroyed entirely, centuries ago, melted down in a deliberate effort to erase the monarchy from history. And still, the tradition dragged itself back out of the ashes. They survived being stolen from inside the Tower of London by a man clever enough to become the keeper's friend before turning on him. They survived 2 world wars, revolts, the slow crumbling of empires. And now, after everything, the fate of their next chapter was decided by one frightened, exhausted man at an hour when the rest of the palace was fast asleep, unaware that their entire future was being rewritten without them. But while Charles sat alone with the weight of what he'd just signed, Camilla was moments away from discovering she had never truly belonged to this family. And once she realized that, she wasn't going to accept it in silence. Camilla didn't hear it from her husband. She heard it from a member of staff, hours after the ink had dried, delivered in that careful, freezing tone people use when they know the words leaving their mouth are about to explode. The instant she heard, she was already marching toward Charles's study. And here's where it becomes even messier. In her rage, Camilla didn't fully close the study door behind her. A staff member standing just outside caught every single word. She told Charles bluntly that he had turned her into nothing while she was still breathing right there as his wife. Charles didn't apologize. What he said back was colder. He told her the crown was never something a wife gets to keep. It was only ever something she'd been allowed to borrow. That single sentence stripped away every polite illusion this family had ever tried to project. He wasn't describing Camilla as a partner, he was describing her as a visitor, someone who had been permitted to handle a few beautiful things for a limited stretch of time, always with the understanding that none of it had ever really been hers. To grasp why that cut so deeply, you have to understand what being a consort in the House of Windsor actually is. A consort does not inherit the throne. A consort does not inherit the crown jewels. A consort only borrows access to certain pieces of jewelry for certain occasions, always at the reigning monarch's discretion, and always with the unspoken agreement that when he dies, most of that access dies with him. Camilla had known this in a distant, abstract way for years, the way you know an uncomfortable truth you'd rather never look directly at. But hearing it spoken aloud to her face, in the same breath as the news that another woman had just been handed permanent, legal, absolute control of those same treasures, transformed a cold old fact into a fresh personal wound. And this eruption wasn't sudden. It had been building underneath the surface for years. Long before this night, Camilla had personally approached the palace jewelry office asking to wear a specific historic diamond necklace for a state visit that mattered enormously to her. She was told the request needed further review. That review never happened. No explanation ever followed. It just dissolved into the same icy silence this palace has spent generations perfecting. Then, 2 years later, that exact same necklace appeared around Catherine's neck at a state dinner, with no warning given to Camilla in advance. She discovered it the same way millions of strangers did, watching it unfold live on her own television. And Camilla never once publicly complained about that necklace. She smiled her way through every photograph, showed up at every joint event, and stood alongside Catherine at official functions as though nothing had ever happened. But according to people who've worked closely with her over the years, she had been keeping a quiet, meticulous record of every single occasion where something she had once softly requested later reappeared on someone else. The individual entries aren't dramatic on their own, but stacked together, they show the outline of a woman who had spent years silently counting every slight while presenting the world with a composed, unbothered face. That kind of patient, buried anger tends to be far more dangerous than anything loud, because it never fades, it only compounds. As if that wasn't enough, the staff member near the study that night caught something even darker. Camilla reportedly said she refused to be the second wife erased from two histories in one lifetime. For years, palace insiders have quietly measured her against Princess Diana, the beloved first wife whose memory Camilla has spent decades struggling to step out of. And now here she was, being pushed to the side a second time in her own life. This time by a woman young enough to be her own daughter. A woman who wasn't even in the building when a decision about her family's legacy was being made behind her back. Twice rejected, decades apart, for the same brutal reason. Camilla would forever be the woman who arrived second, no matter how fiercely she fought to be seen as anything else. Charles didn't call after her when she turned and walked out. He stayed exactly where he was, staring down at the document that had just torn a hole through his marriage. Nobody in the palace yet knew what Camilla intended to do with the fury she was now carrying with her. And that uncertainty alone should unsettle anyone watching this family carefully. Because a woman who has quietly swallowed one insult after another for years does not simply forget the night her husband referred to her as a borrower inside her own home. What she does next is genuinely anyone's guess. Will Camilla swallow this the same way she has swallowed every other slight before it, tucking it into that same private notebook and continuing to smile for the cameras? Or has something inside her finally broken past the point where quiet acceptance is still possible? People close to the household have described her in the days since as unusually withdrawn. She skipped several minor engagements she normally would never miss, and declined to answer when reporters asked her directly about Catherine's new role. Silence inside a family built entirely on carefully choreographed public appearances is almost never just silence. It's almost always a decision being made behind a closed door. And while Camilla sat with the sting of being erased, the woman who had just taken her place, without ever once asking for the war that came attached to it, was already staggering under a weight nobody had thought to explain to her. Before any of this had been made official, Catherine had looked Charles straight in the eye and pleaded with him to wait. Not forever, she'd told him, just until things were less painful for everyone in the family. Charles refused. There would be no waiting, no matter how much devastation it dropped onto the shoulders of the people standing nearest him. That answer alone revealed how desperate he had become. To understand why Catherine even dared to make the request, you have to understand what she had already endured to get here. She had built her own road with her own two hands, working inside her family's small business, and learning through years of ordinary, grinding effort instead of being handed anything. Then cancer came for her too, and forced her out of public life for months while the whole world speculated behind her back. Catherine fought her way back from that quietly, without complaining, and rebuilt her position piece by piece until she was standing beside a visibly failing king in front of the entire world, with everyone in that room fully understanding what her presence there was meant to signal. She had already won one fight nobody expected her to survive. Now she had been handed another one, and this time there was no visible finish line ahead of her. On top of all of that, Catherine had done something almost nobody else in this family had ever managed to accomplish. She had made ancient, dusty pieces of royal history feel alive again to a generation that had grown up scrolling past everything else. Old jewels that had once sat forgotten in storage suddenly appeared on her at precisely the right moment, and the public couldn't stop talking about them. Royal watchers had spent years noticing this pattern, calling it something close to a gift, a rare instinct for breathing new life into treasures that history had nearly buried. That instinct was exactly why Charles trusted Catherine with all of it. Even as it tore his own marriage apart in the process, he wasn't simply protecting jewels physically. Charles was betting the future of the entire institution on the one person he believed could carry it forward without allowing it to fade into irrelevance. So what exactly is Catherine now holding? This is not simply a pretty title or a photo opportunity. The entire monarchy's crown jewels are under her name alone. The imperial state crown sits at the center, dripping with diamonds worth more than the treasuries of many entire countries. The St. Edward's crown is even more sacred, so precious it only emerges once in an entire generation, at the exact second a new monarch is crowned in front of the world. Then there's the Cullinan diamond, ripped out of the earth under brutal colonial mining conditions that cost the lives of workers whose names were never even recorded. And then there's the Koh-i-Noor diamond. This is where the story turns truly savage. The Koh-i-Noor's history doesn't read like the story of a beautiful jewel passed gently from hand to hand. It reads like a body count. Owners who once held it were blinded. Some were tortured until they surrendered it. Others were executed by rivals hungry enough to kill for it. Even today, more than one nation still openly insists it was stolen, not gifted, but torn away during a period the crown would rather the world simply forget. Catherine has not inherited a pretty piece of jewelry to admire behind glass. She has inherited a diamond that multiple governments still describe as stolen property. And now she is the one legally responsible for keeping it locked away, whether she fully understands what she agreed to or not. Diplomats from those nations have quietly raised the issue at official functions for years, always brushed aside or deflected with polite silence. That silence now sits squarely on Catherine's shoulders instead of Charles's, whether she asked for that inheritance or not. To make things even more disturbing, these treasures have already been destroyed once before, and they clawed their way back from nothing. In 1649, the entire original collection was melted down completely. The gold was stripped, and the gems were sold off in a deliberate attempt to wipe the monarchy off the map for good. Yet it dragged itself back in 1661, rebuilt from ashes by people who refused to let it die. And it has only been stolen once, in 1671, by a man named Thomas Blood. The way he pulled it off should send a chill down your spine. Thomas did not smash through a locked door like a common thief. He spent months carefully earning the trust of the vault's own keeper, sharing meals at his table, becoming a friend the man would never suspect, before finally attempting to walk straight out of the Tower of London with the imperial state crown hidden under his cloak. He was caught. And in a twist almost nobody remembers today, the king of the time was so impressed by his sheer nerve that he pardoned him completely instead of sending him to the executioner. Historians have argued for centuries about why that pardon was ever granted. Some claim the king simply admired boldness. Others whisper that Thomas knew secrets about the crown dangerous enough to buy his own freedom. Either way, the treasure has only ever been stolen once, and it was stolen by the one person the keeper trusted most in the entire world. Now, ask yourself something uncomfortable. Catherine is currently the person standing closest to these treasures of anyone alive. What happens when the person trusted the most also happens to be the person with the most to gain from everything locked inside that vault? Catherine is holding history soaked in beheadings, revolutions, and betrayal. And she's holding it without a single guarantee, spoken or written, that any of it will survive her father-in-law's death. Because behind closed doors, the crown's own lawyers were already whispering to each other the one question absolutely nobody wanted spoken out loud. When William and Catherine first received the power to grant royal warrants, the palace threw a full celebration around it. Statements, quotes, press releases handed out to make it feel like triumphant good news. This time, there was nothing. No press conference, no explanation tying any of it to Charles's collapsing health. Just a quiet legal filing buried somewhere nobody would think to look. And that silence screams louder than any press release ever could. Every single thread of the story slams together right here. Charles's health has been called precarious by people close to him, a word that should terrify anyone who understands what it really means coming from inside a palace. The public was told his treatment was being reduced, never that it was ending, and now we finally understand exactly why that word was chosen with so much care. The warrant powers alone are already historic. So historic that even Diana, the most beloved royal wife this family has ever had, was never given that same authority while she was alive. The Indian tiara pulled out of a vault after 20 untouched years, just so Catherine could wear it in public, sent a message that the monarchy wanted the world to believe it was strong and stable, no matter what was crumbling behind closed doors. And then there's the line that has followed this family for months. The calm, chilling admission from people close to the palace that William and Catherine have been ready for whatever was required of them. Just look closely at the pattern building underneath every one of these moves, and a picture starts to form that's impossible to unsee. Each announcement arrived quietly, dressed up as routine, never once framed publicly as urgent. Each one on its own could be explained away as ordinary succession planning that any long-reigning monarch might arrange years in advance. But stacked together in this order, at this speed, they stop looking like careful planning and start looking like a man racing against a clock only he can see ticking. Royal historians who have studied past reigns say they cannot find another example of this many major powers shifting this fast without an official announcement ever confirming why. There's something else here too, something colder than family politics. Everywhere Catherine goes, whatever she wears sells out almost instantly. The pattern is so powerful that it has become its own quiet economic engine, driving the entire monarchy forward. Crowds behave differently around her. Cameras chase her longer. So Charles understood exactly what he was doing by placing these treasures in her hands specifically. He was not simply protecting jewels. He was making sure the one person capable of keeping this entire institution alive for a new generation was also the one person now legally chained to its most sacred symbols. But here is what has never been said publicly until now. According to people familiar with the private discussions happening inside the palace, at least one senior legal advisor raised a possibility dark enough to shake anyone who thinks this story is finished. That advisor reportedly suggested that Camilla, as Charles's surviving wife, could one day use her legal status as his widow to drag this exact order into a courtroom after Charles is gone. Nothing this rigid, this binding, this total guardianship of the crown's most sacred and disputed treasures handed to someone who isn't even the monarch yet has ever been attempted this far ahead of an actual coronation in this family's entire history. Which means everything Catherine has just survived, the confrontation, the crushing pressure, the weight of guarding treasures with blood already soaked into their history, might not be the end of this war at all. It might only be the opening shot. Legal scholars who study the royal prerogative have quietly pointed out that a challenge like this would drag British courts into territory nobody has ever tested, forcing judges to decide whether even a king's signed word can survive a furious widow determined to fight for what she believes was stolen from her. And then there's trooping the color. According to people close to the planning of that event, palace staff have quietly started using language normally reserved for occasions of historic finality. The exact kind of language people use when they privately believe they are watching something for the very last time. Extra medical personnel have been added to the routine coverage, a detail nobody inside the palace has explained, and nobody has bothered to deny either. Why would anyone need extra doctors standing by for a ceremony that has run every year for generations without a single incident? Ask yourself that, and you already know why so many people close to this family believe they know exactly what is coming. Some insiders have gone even further, whispering that plans are already quietly being drawn up for what comes immediately after. Contingency arrangements nobody wants named directly, but everybody in that building already understands. Nothing this urgent has torn through this family since one former king walked away from the throne entirely for the woman he loved. A decision that shook this institution to its foundations and changed its course forever. What is happening now feels just as seismic, and the ground underneath this family is shifting faster than the public has ever been allowed to see. History rarely announces itself with a press release. It happens in signed documents in midnight rooms and in ancient jewels placed on a head that was never supposed to carry them, yet until suddenly, without warning, without ceremony, it does. The real question was never simply whether Catherine becomes queen one day. It was always how soon that day finally arrives, and whether the crown she is guarding right now will even still belong to her by the time it does.